Compañero, welcome. My name is Carlos El Chacon, and my podcast aims to bring you together with others working with SQL Server and engage in conversations to share ideas, meet old friends, and make a few new friends along the way. I call it the SQL Trail. Thanks for joining me.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome again to the SQL Trail. This is episode 132, and our topic today is what technologists can learn from superheroes. Our guest is Will Fehringer. He is a consultant with Captech Technologies in Richmond, Virginia. I heard Will speak at an Agile conference, and he gave this talk and shared some ideas, again, about this idea of what we can learn from superheroes, and I thought it would be very applicable to our podcast. And so we pluck a few ideas from his talk, and we're going to go through those today. So I think you'll find that interesting, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Before we get into that, however, we do have a couple of compañero shout-outs. Was lucky enough to make it down to SQL Saturday Raleigh this last weekend, and I got to catch up with the organizer, Kevin Fiesel. And luckily for us, Jonathan Stewart was on the other side of the country, so... we had a good time. Actually, Kevin actually broke out his drone and started flying that around. And there was actually a picture of us on Twitter if you happen to see that. It was also nice to catch up with some other compañeros, Tom Norman, Paul Popovich, Chris Voss, James Howard, both excellent volunteers, and we need to figure out how to get them up involved in Richmond. Mark Wilkinson has been a guest on this podcast, as well as Kevin Wilkie. And Kevin, if you're listening, just remember you still owe me that thing that you owe me. Just saying. And good things come to those who wait. Special shout out to Stephen Bennett and Andrew Notarian, especially for Stephen in that through a clerical error, we failed to get him on the show earlier. And so thanks, Stephen, for hanging in there. So, compañeros, we do have a little SQL Server in the news. Wanted to pass along to you. And the SQL Cat team. So this is going to be on Twitter. If you are on Twitter, actually it started this last Monday. They will be posting, so that this is the account at SQL Server. They will be posting a tweet each Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern, I believe. 9 a.m. Pacific, obviously, because they're in Redmond. Makes more sense. And they will be using the hashtag SQL Data Win. And they want you to respond to that scenario, the scenario they put out. And if you're selected, they'll enter you into some cool prizes. Now, unfortunately, everyone's welcome to participate. If you want to win, you do need to be a resident of the United States. So there is that for all of you who are listening overseas. So I apologize. And again, that started this last Monday. So I'm interested to see what happens there. And we may pass along a couple of those that we think are funny if it makes sense to do so. Okay, so our episode show notes for today is going to be SQLDataPartners.com/superheroes or SQLDataPartners.com/123. Now, I will go ahead and say that I managed to switch a character, and I said that they were from, the Marvel and DC universe. I got them mixed up because I hadn't seen the movies, and anyway, and so I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there now. So if that's a deal breaker for you, then please don't listen to this episode because it's going to happen. Will, welcome to the program.
Hi, Carlos. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on today, a local Richmonder at that. So thanks for taking a little time to chat with us. Now, I saw your presentation at an Agile conference, and I thought it was very entertaining and enlightening. And so ultimately, what we wanted to talk about today was superhero syndrome.
Absolutely.
Maybe why it's bad, not bad, but how it affects us and maybe ways that we can get around that. You have some great examples from the current superhero movies that are out from both DC and Marvel. So we're kind of an equal opportunity.
Absolutely. Got to represent both sides of the house.
That's right. So let's go ahead and jump into that idea. So what is superhero syndrome?
Sure, yeah. So superhero syndrome, I see this all the time with teams that I work with. It's this idea that we overcommit to something or we set too ambitious of a deadline or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden we have that uh-oh moment where we realize that we're in trouble and we got way more work than we're able to get done. So what I see most teams do, and I do this myself as well, is rather than kind of bring transparency and say, uh-oh, we got to push our deadline, we got to do less, we got to limit our scope, we try to really buckle down. I can get it all done. I know I can do it. And we try to pull heroics to get everything across the finish line. And sometimes this can work, and sometimes it can work well. I'm sure you might remember days of trying to do that, buckle down and really cram right before a final exam. And sometimes that's exactly what you need. But not a sustainable way of doing work. I'm sure you remember you cram real hard for final exam, and then as soon as you finish, you want to go relax, take a break the next couple weeks. So
Yeah, you're not interested in looking at that textbook again.
exactly. So it's something that you don't want to make it a habit in your organization. So I see this all the time and really wanted to talk about it. And I thought, what a better metaphor to talk about superhero syndrome than using actual superheroes.
That's right. We've got some great references there. There is one more angle that I thought over that I think applies more particularly to the listeners of this program. That is this idea that because with your skill set, you're scooping in and kind of saving the day. But I mean, almost to your point, you're not putting in processes there that are going to allow you to not have to do that anymore. We just kind of get these continual swoop ins and, oh, let me save the day when, hey, maybe spending a little bit more time making sure that our playing field is in good shape would not require me to do that.
Absolutely. And I get the sense there are some people out there, and I'm sure it's none of your listeners, but who kind of make a career out of making emergencies and then swooping in and saving the day. And that's certainly one way to do it, but you're completely right. If upper management never realizes that there's a problem, there's never the time taken to sit back and think and really try to problem solve and say, is there a better way we can be doing this because something's broken? If we're always delivering on time, you never realize that there's actually a problem there.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so that brings us then to the downsides of the superhero syndrome, right? Is that not being able to recognize that there is a problem.
Yeah, I think a great example of that downside, like you mentioned, of not recognizing the problem, and I talked about this in my speech, is from the movie Wonder Woman. And I'd love to talk about this example because I saw this movie. I was sitting on my couch watching this and thinking, this is a crazy scene right now. I can't believe what's going on in front of me. And it's the scene in Wonder Woman where the German army, it's set in World War I, and they come onto Paradise Island. They start attacking the Amazons.
Right.
And the long and short of it is that the Amazons were woefully underprepared for this attack, despite being these elite warriors. And they needed Wonder Woman to save them. And so it worked. They saved the day. They had a literal superhero save them. But then kind of my thought after this was, well, have they learned? Why were they underprepared?
Sure.
Have they made the changes they needed to be prepared in the future? And really part of what they weren't prepared about was that they had this vast new technology. They had guns and Amazons didn't. And so it made me think, are the Amazons going to get guns and learn from this experience? And sure enough, they don't. Obviously, it would break the Wonder Woman universe if you gave Wonder Woman and the Amazons a bunch of guns to go around. But I think it proves a great point of maybe, I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. But the other way is maybe they just didn't feel like they needed guns because they didn't recognize there was a problem.
Sure. So using that story as a backdrop is a perfect scenario. And so there are a couple of points that you mentioned. So let's dive into a few of those. So one, you mentioned that they're on the island.
Right.
And they've been put there to save mankind from Ares, right? From the god of war.
Exactly. Yep.
But that's what they think they're kind of preparing for. But as time goes on, it seems like they kind of lose that idea or that vision. And they just become really, really good at fighting.
Right. Yeah. This was another kind of moment where I'm watching this movie and being like, this is crazy. I can't believe what I'm watching here. Their goal, at least as the movie states it at the beginning of the movie, is to protect mankind from Ares. And prior to Wonder Woman starting, Ares comes in and nearly wipes out all of the gods, and it takes Zeus himself to stop Ares.
Right.
And Zeus says, you know what, I need to make sure that this never happens again. So he creates the Amazons and puts them on Paradise Island to try to make sure that that never happens again. And what ends up happening, I feel like I see this a lot at organizations, is they've been on this literal island where they're just talking amongst themselves about what they have to do, and they start to slowly lose sight of what it was they really were intending to do in the first place, which was defeat Ares. And like you said, they're training all the time, they're battling all the time, and you get these great fight scenes where they're training and using their spears and their bows and arrows. But I think they really lose sight of the fact that the goal is to make sure that they prevent Ares from coming back. And to do that, you want to be the best warrior possible, not necessarily the best archer or the best spear fighter in the world. You want to be the best warrior, and you need to keep up with the trends in warfare, essentially, to be able to be competitive with the most elite warriors that could come at you. And in this case, the most elite warrior being Ares himself.
Right. And that's very challenging for all of us, particularly in technology. You feel like you've just spent all this time. I've spent 10 years finally understanding client server architecture,
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, let's change the game, or let's do something different. And we're going to introduce serverless. And you're like, oh, brother, you've got to be joking me.
Right. So it's tough, but I love the metaphor in Wonder Woman of them being on a literal island.
Right.
It's so easy when you're at your organization and you start to get the hang of whatever technology stack that you're using at your organization. And then all of a sudden you pick your head up and you look around and you realize you're 10 years behind everyone else. So it's a tough thing to do for sure.
Yeah. So when you become the go-to person, it's very easy to feel like your role in the world, it is a bit inflated, right? Because yes, when you're on the island and you're the best warrior, that's great. And I think obviously listeners of this podcast, my compañeros, they're trying to expose themselves to different things. And not saying that you have to be the best, whatever, but at least knowing what it is and being exposed to it, being able to speak to it, I think at least is a huge step in the right direction to help you get off the island when the time eventually will come that you have to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that the fact that you're listening to this podcast is a great example that you're looking to expand your knowledge. So hopefully this isn't too tough of a sell to the listeners right now to go out and find information about what else is going on.
Right.
So hopefully this should be a great audience for that message.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you mentioned that evolution. Obviously, Wonder Woman goes on to save them. And you mentioned well, hey, after that first Wonder Woman movie, you'd think, do I have improved weaponry, or am I getting better? And here you actually reference a behind the scenes shot. They're making the final Avengers movie. Everybody comes together and there's a shot there of the Amazonians. And it looks like they're pretty much in the same garb as they were in Wonder Woman, right?
Exactly. This is this idea that, well, if you're the director, you can't put the Amazons in guns or whatever. But I have this great screenshot and I put this together. This was for the Justice League movie where we get all of our DC heroes together, and it hadn't been released when I was putting this together, but I found this behind the scenes clip. I'm sure there's a screenshot now, but it's such a great screenshot because you've got them with the shields and spears, and there's even someone with a trident in there. And I love that as the peak of technology that they got into as a trident. That's not very far from a spear. So
right.
Haven't made any progress really.
Okay, so we're testing my superhero knowledge. I called Wonder Woman. I put her in the Avengers movie. Oh, yikes. And then I referenced the Batman movie, which I haven't seen yet. So, man,
You might have some angry DC or Marvel fans writing you up about that one.
Yes, I'm sorry, compañeros. It was an honest mistake, I promise. In the heat of recording, I made a mistake there.
It's all good.
Now, this leads into an interesting idea or conversation about prioritization. Because there are only so many hours in the day. We are human. And where to go, not only with our teams, but individually, professionally. How do we make good choices there? And you mentioned this idea that I thought was interesting, called it the fool's choice.
Yeah.
Talk to us about this. What's the fool's choice?
Yeah. So the fool's choice, it's from the book called Crucial Conversations. And the idea of the book is talking about what they label crucial conversations, which is any kind of conversation where there's high stakes. It's difficult conversation that you have to have with someone. And I think it's a great book. I really recommend it. It's a great book to work on soft skills and communication skills. And I really enjoyed it and have taken to it. And they talk about the fool's choice, which is this idea in a crucial conversation. You only have one of two choices. You can either tell an uncomfortable truth that you need to tell to kind of move the conversation forward, or you can stay silent and keep the peace. The example that I like to use with this is a boss who comes to you and says, we need to figure out a new money-saving initiative. Brainstorm some ideas and come back to me with some ideas on how we can save some money. Maybe we can print on both sides of the paper going forward, or maybe we don't get the trash taken out only 3 days a week instead of every day of the week. But let me know what you guys come up with. And after this conversation with the boss goes away and the team comes together and says, hey, didn't that boss just spend a ton of money getting a new corner office with all these nice new furnishings? And so the team isn't bought into this idea whatsoever, and they kind of do a half-hearted effort. Now the boss comes back and asks for the ideas, and there's a bunch of half-hearted responses, and the boss says, what's going on? You guys usually come up with such great ideas. What's going on? This is kind of a perfect example of the fool's choice, where there's missing information from the conversation. The boss doesn't realize that the team is kind of doing a half-hearted job because they don't believe the boss is fully invested in this cost-saving initiative. And why should we have to suffer and save all these pennies after you just spent all this money redesigning your new corner office?
You're asking us to be penny wise when you've been pound foolish.
Exactly. So this is the fool's choice. And this is something that I run into all the time, where you can either try to tell that uncomfortable truth, but there's always that risk that how are they going to react? Are they going to react poorly? Maybe I should just stay silent instead and not say anything. So that's the fool's choice. And what the book kind of talks about and what we like to think about is, how can we break away from that fool's choice? How can we tell the uncomfortable truth that gets that important information out there, but also still maintain a good relationship with that person going forward? And it's not an easy thing to do. It's so hard that someone wrote a whole book about it. A lot of great tactics in there, but I think the idea of a fool's choice in a more generic sense is that maybe you're tunnel visioned in, you're thinking you've only got one of two choices. Maybe there's a third choice where you can get both of the things that you want. And that's what I kind of recommend people to think about, is take a step back and say, is there a way we can figure out how to not have to make this difficult decision and actually get both things we want?
And so we're going to use a superhero example here.
Yeah.
And we're going to use Drax.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave two interesting examples with Drax. And this is from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2.
Yep.
Where Drax is talking to Star-Lord. And they show this in the trailer, right? And he says, you need a woman who is pathetic, like you.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so in my mind, this is a perfect example of fool's choice, where he thinks that Peter needs to hear this information, that he needs to maybe lower his standards and find a different woman, but he is a little brash about it, right? And so that...
And I think this resonates because a lot of technologists tend to go the brash way, right?
Absolutely.
People, they try to do something, and again, you've had all this experience with computers. They do something that's not incorrect. And it's, you need to get away from the computer because you are an idiot, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's one option.
Exactly. And so it's figuring out that way, can you get that important information of getting access to the computer without damaging that relationship with that person as well? And it's a tricky thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that then gets to the point of, it doesn't have to be either or. You can say something, but it doesn't have to be blunt force trauma to the head.
Yep.
Either.
Exactly. And I think that leads perfectly into the example I followed up with, which is that it comes later in the second Guardians of the Galaxy, where Drax is talking to Mantis and explaining how she's very ugly as a pet of it's Peter's dad in the movie, and she's his pet. Right. And what he's trying to get across is that it's good that you're ugly because people want cute pets. So if they love you when you're ugly, that means they actually love you for who you are. So it's actually a very sweet message that he gets across.
Right.
And she ends the conversation saying, oh, well, I'm certainly glad to be ugly then. And it's a funny scene, but I think it's a good example of where he finally, after 2 full movies, kind of overcomes this fool's choice at least a little bit. Maybe telling someone they're ugly isn't the best example of that, but I smiled when I saw that part because I was like, well, he kind of overcame it. He got that information out there, and she was happy by the end of the conversation. So,
right. And if you're known for being that very direct type of person, anytime you can then tie that in and at least helping the person understand where you're coming from and having them appreciate it, you're headed in the right direction.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different techniques you can use to overcome this fool's choice. And I encourage listeners to check out the Crucial Conversations book if this is interesting to you. And they go into much greater depth about what these techniques are. But some of them, in the Drax example here, is kind of explaining the purpose and taking a step back and saying, hey, I'm not here to attack you. I'm not saying you're ugly just to hurt your feelings. Why I'm telling you that you're ugly is because I'm trying to convey this information that it means that you're actually loved for who you are. And so just being able to step out of the conversation, explain why, make sure that you're explaining your purpose for giving it and making sure, hey, I'm not attacking you. This is why we're here, is a literal textbook example out of the book of how you can avoid that fool's choice. And there's several other techniques as well, but I thought that was a great example of one that came right from the movie.
Right. And I think that this is something that for most of us, we'll have to practice, right? We'll have to try to get better with. It doesn't take long. As humans, we're a social bunch. And you can see in certain areas where they've pretty much abandoned this and thinking. I think to get political for a second, right? Most of what we see in political commentary now is definitely an or.
Yeah.
You're either for me or you're against me.
Yeah, that's a great point there. I talked about in the talk as well, is this idea of and thinking versus or thinking, where with the fool's choice, you're really thinking in terms of or thinking. I can either have one or the other. I can either tell the uncomfortable truth or keep the peace. What I want to encourage people to think about is looking for those opportunities to think in terms of and. Can I get the 2 things that I want? Can I tell the uncomfortable truth and still maintain that relationship?
Right. Tell my boss, well, I'm not sure I can meet that deadline, but then give him something so that, he doesn't go through the roof, or she.
Exactly. And there's nuance there because sometimes and thinking is the wrong thing. It's give me everything I want and we're not making a priority choice. So there's the subtle nuance there that when we talk about and thinking, we're not just talking about doing everything. That's kind of the opposite of a lot of what I talked about, which is how to make good priority choices.
Right.
But it's finding, is there a third option or is there a different way we can approach this problem that gives us everything that we want without forcing us to do a bunch of work, to fall into that superhero syndrome that we talked about earlier to get everything that we want? Is there a clever way that we can approach this problem?
Yeah, that's right. Well, awesome. Will, great information. And I thought it was very interesting the way that you put that together. And of course, use the references there. So we're glad to have you on the program today. Should we go ahead and do SQL Family?
Absolutely.
So how did you first get started in technology?
Yeah, it's been an interesting career path. I guess I've always been interested in technology and using technology. I ended up getting an engineering degree. I was good at math and fairly tech savvy, got a systems engineering degree, and started working for my current company, Captech Consulting, which does IT consulting. And I've kind of meandered through more technical roles and less technical roles and landed in my current role, which is very non-technical, working with agile teams as an agile coach to help them with their team dynamics. So it's been an interesting journey of kind of coming from a somewhat technical background and then winding up in this role that is almost non-technical entirely.
Right. So in that winding around, what's the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Yeah, I think I talked with my mentor one time, and she works really well with teams and has had really awesome success at getting teams to come together and collaborate. And I asked her, what's your secret? How are you so successful with this? And what she told me is you just have to actually care about them. And she didn't phrase it exactly like that. I think she used a word that's probably not allowed on this podcast, that you have to give a blank about your teams. But I think that piece of advice has taken me so far, is that if you really care about something, really actually care about the teams and care about what you're doing and have that passion, that'll take you really far. I found that to really be helpful, is just really having that passion for what you're doing and really putting in that time.
Our last question for you today, which is ironic, seeing as normally our only superhero talk is at the end. But
yeah.
Our last question for you today, if you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
I've had this asked a few times and it's tough, but Superman by himself is so strong, so powerful. I think that there's something to be said for that, in the sense that he's virtually indestructible. So that's kind of my cheap answer, but I think time travel would be pretty interesting. There's a lot of interesting things you could do if you could go back in time, and we could certainly help our editors today not have to go back if we had that.
Well, awesome. Will, thanks so much for being on the program today. I do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So this, I think, is interesting. And again, we shared some ideas, the whole idea of learning and evolving. This idea of the fool's choice, we didn't have enough time to dig into it, maybe as much as I wanted to. But this idea that, again, you have two options: tell the truth or to stay silent and keep the peace, suffer in misery. And this idea in this book, I haven't gotten through the book, but in looking at some of the feedback and the other comments, if you will, about the book, one of the things that they do put out is that you then have to have a framework. And one of the things that they talk about is the ability for you to express your voice in a safe place. And I'm not sure that enough of us do a great job of making our work a safe place. I think a lot of times as technologists, we tend to pound our chests a bit. We know more than others. And if they differ from us, then they're incorrect. Now, obviously, you're welcome to that opinion, but I think if we're going to have these conversations, and even though you may know quite a bit, you are going to have a crucial conversation at some point with someone, whether it be, whether you're the nervous one or they're the nervous one, and creating that environment where everyone can share that opinion. You don't have to agree with it. In fact, I'm thinking about a social media post that Jimmy May posted recently, going back in the day, and talking about how they were able to, in their SQL Server training, they were actually able to get into politics a bit and share different ideas without it boiling over into a contentious, nuclear waste site. And so if you're interested in that, be sure to go and take a peek at the book. Again, that book is called Crucial Conversations: Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Some interesting thoughts that were shared there. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. Of course, compañeros, we're always interested in hearing from you, what you have to say. If you think there's topics that we should be talking about, please let us know. You can reach out to me on social media. On LinkedIn, I am at Carlos L. Chacon, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.